Okay, what's up, everybody? Uh, Welcome to Who's Your Rabbi? My name is Jaime, and I want to say shalom and hava to everybody. And today, we're going to continue with our little exposition on the greatest mitzvot. Um, and like I said, we did the actual text, and then with the correlation that they have to the Ten Commandments. And now we're gonna do like a little bit more research and kind of see what the Gospels, and we're gonna try to keep them in the actual order that they were written in. So we're gonna, in this case, we're gonna start off with Mark, and in particular Mark 7, um, and see what uh, you know his version of the story has to say in regards to what Jesus what it said. And the reason I actually went with chapter 7 today was because I'm actually doing some coursework, um, as far as just the Bible itself in general. Um, and so today I was listening to a lesson um, on Leviticus and how it correlates with the New Testament, and it just kind of like spawned from there. So I listened to a couple other things, and as reading and analyzing the text myself, um, just kind of you know came up with this lesson, pretty much on the fly, and and so we're gonna go. Um, and we'll get into details and in the next couple of chapters if we have to refine it a little bit or add a little bit more insight into it, then we'll go ahead and do that. But um, like I said, the core uh, text that we're analyzing today is in Mark chapter 7. And just a little bit of background. This is where a couple of Pharisees um, who went up to the Galilee um, kind of challenged Jesus on a couple of things, right? And so, you know, classic Pharisaic rabbinical, you know, debate style. But at this point, it seems there that intent and somewhat malice, starts to build up. And so, in the same classical way, Jesus just basically schools them. And the main question that you want to ask is, well, first of all, when you hear any Christian interpretation of this text, it gets slightly distorted. And there's a couple reasons for that. And I'm not saying they're right. I'm not saying that they're completely wrong. But the the primary issue is that, excuse me, somewhere early along, um, when they were putting together the manuscripts, somebody actually edited the text slightly. So, and that's known just because there's other versions of the text that can be referenced, and they do the whole carbon dating and all that stuff, so they have an idea of which one came first, and the older ones seem to align with um, some with each other and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how uh, that somebody actually went and um, added a couple little things here and there, or took away a couple of things here and there. And so, you know, for the most part, we have a fairly complete version of Mark, but there are some questions um, as far as, what parts are or aren't, original. Um, and you'll see that in this text right here. And so, like I said, most Christian interpretations use this as part of their defense to not um, follow the dietary laws or Kashrut or the Kosher um, laws. And this, first of all, their defense falls apart for a lot of reasons, but the primary reason why um, their defense falls apart is because they don't even understand, the kosher aspect and what applies and who it applies to and who it doesn't apply to. So, like I said, we're doing the Acts series. This is kind of correlating with that, also, but you can view it independently. You can view it. It connects with a couple other sources, and so let's analyze the text, and we'll kind of go from there. So, and as I'm going, I'll give you some of the reasons as to why the traditional Christian interpretation, for the most part, um, in fact, when it comes to the dietary laws, is wrong to begin with, because um, we'll follow the text, and you'll see that this text uh, actually is questionable whether it has to even do with that or not. So, let's read the text. I'm sorry, Mark chapter 7, and we're going to go from verses 1 to 23. We'll stop along the way and we'll break it down. Um, I'm reading off of my notes, so the enumeration of the actual verses themselves, I'm not referencing it right now, so we'll go back and do that eventually. But it starts off saying, "Now the Pharisees and some of the Torah scholars who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Yeshua. And they saw that some of his disciples were eating bread with unclean hands, that is, not washed." Okay, so we're gonna pause there, and we're gonna, discuss this a little bit, because as you can see from right off the bat, the editor finds the need to explain something, and these next verses are actually in parentheses. So, what that basically tells you is that most, biblical scholars and you know, ar- archaeologists and all, just people that study the text itself, don't think that these are original verses that were in the original text. So they're not coming from Mark, assuming that Mark was the actual writer of the text, and having a direct connection with some of the apostles, the disciples of Jesus. Then he would have had some of this information, but also taken into you know uh, consideration that Mark was actually Jewish. So if he's Jewish and he's writing to a primarily Jewish uh, audience, then why the need to explain? So this is something that was added eventually, because at the time that the Gospels, even if you have a late reference point for the writing of the actual Gospel itself, would still be a primarily. It's in the first century. It's mid, you know, uh, first century, and so it's within 20, 30 years of Jesus's ministry, and so it's pretty early on, and the community itself is primarily Jewish. So it's not a Gentile, uh, you know, church or and I just like using that terminology just because of the modern meaning of it. But um, it's not a community that is primarily Gentile. The Gentiles are grafted in; they are participating in this, but it's primarily a Jewish movement, as it will continue to be up until the early fourth century. So let's move on. Okay, so see, the person who edited this found a need to explain it. It says, "For the Pharisees and all Jewish people do not eat unless they wash their hands up to their elbows, keeping the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they perform ritual washing. There are many other traditions they have received and hold, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and copper vessels." Um, so we just see that just from the commentary explanation, uh, chances are that this is not the original writer. This is not Mark, uh, who would have understood these things, but also would be writing to a primarily Jewish audience. Um, and so, you know, this is, it would have just been understood basically. But let's keep going. And then the next verse says, "The Pharisees and the Torah scholars question Yeshua, 'Why don't your disciples walk according to the traditions of the elders? Why do they eat bread with unwashed hands?'" So, okay, we have two groups of people here. We have Pharisees and we have Torah scholars, and there's a reason for that, because they're not one and the same. Like modern, teachers tend to group them all together and then generalize, and then either put the blame or put the fault or in some cases even defend them. But um, you know, a, a scholar or a scribe, because sometimes we'll get that terminology too, didn't necessarily have to be of the Pharisaic schools. Okay, so didn't necessarily have to be one of those, or vice versa. A Pharisee didn't necessarily dedicate himself to being a scribe or to being a scholar or a lawyer in some translations. That might be another term that you might see. And basically, people that are knowledgeable of Torah and halacha and everything that has to do with Jewish culture. So let's keep going. Uh, so they question him about, you know, his disciples not keeping the traditions of the elders, and in particular, one tradition. It is the washing of the hands. Okay, so it's not the eating of bread part, and so we start to see the issue that Jesus takes up, and how he goes about it is pretty interesting, pretty amazing actually. As I was going through it and like analyzing and breaking it down, I was like, man, all these things that he did in one shot in this little section of the Gospels, um, just gives you a good perspective of where Jesus stood in his time, right? According to the Judaism of his time and his in context with the culture. And so, issue number one, okay, it's public humiliation versus private discussion. So the reason Jesus takes an issue with this is not the fact that he's being questioned about, whether his disciples follow certain traditions or anything like that. It's the matter in which it was done. So the intent behind it seems to be that they wanted to publicly humiliate his disciples, and by that they humiliate the teacher, right? And this is, we're talking about Jesus, Yeshua. And so, um, you know, Jesus takes an issue with that, and the way he handles it is pretty pretty amazing, pretty interesting. So first of all, he basically goes into Torah 101. Okay, he's gonna break down the Torah, just like we just discussed about the greatest mitzvot and how he breaks it all down by summarizing the Torah and the Ten Commandments into two subsections. You know what I mean? Um, he basically does a similar thing in this situation. So he starts with the Nevi'im, right, and then he goes into a midrash, and we're gonna discuss a little bit more what it is, and then he starts to use Agadah, right? And uh, and so the first thing he does is he paraphrases, right? Remember, Jesus is not walking around with his JPS Tanakh, you know, or his it's definitely not, you know, the complete Jewish Bible or the TLV or any of the messianic translations that are out there now, which are Jewish in perspective, um, because you know it just it wasn't available, okay, and you're not gonna be walking around with a bunch of Torah scrolls either. So you can see the oral tradition that is behind it, because while he references something in the scriptures, um, it's not necessarily word for word, but it's pretty close. So he has a pretty good memorization, um, you know, thing going on there. And so he goes into the Nevi'im, and in this particular case, he quotes from Isaiah, right? And so here's where he starts his rebuttal and his response. He says, and he said to them, "Rightly did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching doctrines as commandments of man." And then we're going to reference the actual scripture itself. And this is Isaiah 29:13, and I'm reading from the TLV version. And look at how it differentiates the two, even though technically it's supposed to be the same thing, right? So that's how you can tell that Jesus was somewhat, paraphrasing um, from the actual scriptures themselves, but not reading word for word, you could say. Um, And so it says, Adonai says, since these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, yet their hearts are far from me, and their fear of me is a mitzvah taught by men. That's once again Isaiah 29:13. So it's slightly different, but you get the gist of it. You get the fact that Jesus knows, um, you know, the core of the teaching, and that's what he's trying to throw at his opponents in this case, right? And then he keeps going. For Moses said, "Honor your father and your mother." So that's the fifth commandment, right? So he's going into the commandments. He's getting into the core of the Torah. We've already discussed what the Torah is basically, essentially. Love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. You know, this is the core of the Torah. Everything else is just commentary. In one of the variations of it, right? And so we keep reading. And he who speaks of evil of his father and mother must be put to death. But you say, if anyone tells his father and mother, whatever you might have gained from me is korban, that is an offering to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, making void the word of God with your traditions that you handed down, and you do many such things. So, like I said, issue number one is that they're trying to publicly humiliate him, and instead of putting him aside and saying, hey, you know, here's the deal, how come, you know, your disciples don't do this, um, or better yet, not even bringing it up. It's like it's not really their business, you know. He's their rabbi, he's their teacher, he's doing things a certain way, and it's none of their business how he does it, and especially if it's not breaking any kind of actual command. So that's the main point here, right? Okay, so then he keeps going. Then Yeshua called the crowd again and began saying to them, hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing outside the man that can make him unholy by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of the man that makes the man unholy. So this is that verse in particular, or one of those verses that gets twisted around by Christian interpretation. And so this is where they say, oh well, this is where Jesus voids um, kosher law for the his followers, for his believers, for the Christian. Um, but you have a lot of issues if you actually study this enough, and understand the culture, right? Because um, if Jesus is saying that it's cool not to keep kosher, then his disciples are, don't keep kosher, and he's not keeping kosher, then guess what? We have an issue, because what are his followers going around and proclaiming later on? And what is the issue actually, pretty much for the remainder of the first century after his execution and the resurrection? The claim that he is Messiah, right? Who are they saying he's saying? He's Mashiach, right? And or the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, right? And so if you understand the messianic prophecies, you'll understand that um, the Messiah is Moshe numero dos, number two. So it's, you know, um, and you get that from Deuteronomy 18:15 and verse 18, where it's reiterated. And I'm going to read that right now. It says, Adonai your God will raise up from you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brothers. To him you must listen. So this is Moses in verse 15 telling Israel that there's going to be a prophet like him. And this eventually develops into a messianic prophecy, and one of the key ones, one of the first ones, one of the earliest ones, because first you have to be like Moshe, right? And if you understand, the word Messiah is related to the word Moshe, or to the name of Moshe, right? So it's Moshe and Mashiach. And who's the Mashiach? Well, under most understandings, the Mashiach is Moses number two, right? Or even greater than Moses, and he therefore can actually, um, if need be, make changes and or modifications. All the other prophets will fall into the rest of the description that that is given in Deuteronomy 18 about prophets in general, right? And prophets of God, and then prophets in general. So if there's other prophets, there's a way to figure out, if they're from God or if they're not from God, and then how you deal with them. But in particular, this is one of those um, verses where um, it gets applied to the messianic prophecies. And so let's you have an issue there if Jesus is going to be breaking, rules. The other thing is that he's Ben David, right? The son of David. So that's where the anointed one comes from. But 2 Samuel 7 is where you get the actual covenant that was made with David. Um, and there's maybe like two or three verses, so I didn't want to read the whole thing, but that's where you'll see the covenant that was made, and how you end up with this idea of a future anointed one who's a king of Israel and Judah, and who will reign forever, right? And those are references that are made also in the Psalms, and also in the book of Hebrews, and Psalm 110, and the book of Hebrews in particular, when talking about Melchizedek, right? And who is Melchizedek? Well, Melchizedek is actually not a name; it's a title, and it's the my king, the righteous, or a righteous king, right? And this righteous character is referenced from Genesis 14, where he he shows up to Abraham after Abraham's won a battle, and then Abraham gives him uh, uh, a tithe. And these are, there's teachings that develop, especially in Second Temple Judaism, um, that align this character to the anticipated Messiah character, right? Okay, so let's keep going. Um, so once he calls the crowd, and then he tells them it's not what goes into man that makes him unholy. So look at the question. The question was about uncleanliness or impurity, right? So this has to do with the purity, impurity, and or clean and unclean uh, things that are discussed in the Torah, in particular in Leviticus. And so, Jesus comes back and, well, first of all, rebuttals with the prophets, or particular prophets, but the message of the prophets is pretty much the same. And then he goes into the commandments, and then uh, he tells them, he tells the crowd, you know, that this is what makes you unholy. Um, so if we keep reading, it says, when he had left the crowd, he entered the house. His disciples questioned him about the parable. So first of all, you have to ask yourself. We just read, you know, one verse to the next verse, and there's only a slight interpolation in there, but there's no parable in the text. The only way you kind of get a gist of it is because the part that's left out tells you that some versions have, and those who have ears to hear, let them hear, which is typically how he starts and or end caps a parable. So we know that he did go into a parable. What that parable was is what we don't know, but that's where he gets that. That's where he goes into Agadah, right? So Agadah is one of the techniques, and it's basically using stories, and you'll see this throughout the in the Talmud with the Mishnah, and in particular the Gemara. The Gemara is really Agadah, and so it's different discussions and stories that are used to kind of convey the message. Um, so it's a technique that was used even before it was actually written down in a codified form with the Babylonian or the Yerushalimian Babylonian Talmuds. And so you can see Jesus is super aware of the oral tradition. He's not against the oral tradition, but he and he even uses the oral tradition to kind of rebuttal some of these cases. There's a similar event that happens where he gets questioned on his disciples doing something on Shabbat, and that's where he replies, you know, where the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And if you know where that comes from, you'll understand that he's using basically their traditions and throwing back their tradition in their face, you know, using that as the answer. And so that would have, um, you know, made them kind of question themselves, and that's what he's doing. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily that he's not for the Sabbath, because once we get to the actual teaching on the Sabbath, it'll be more clear. But every time Jesus is doing something when it comes to a Sabbath, and it's mentioned in the Gospels, and or even the feast, he's doing what he has to be doing when he has to be doing it. So, and if he didn't, once again, automatic disqualification. Man, he's not the Mashiach. Okay, so we have to be aware of those things, because you know, then you start turning Jesus into once upon a time Jesus, and magical Jesus, and all these other versions of Jesus that are not what the text tells you. And it's not to say that some of those things didn't take place. I'm just saying that we if we understand the context behind them, it'll make much more sense than what you can get out of it just by getting somebody's uh, you know interpretation and personal insight into it. Like I said, I try to give you sources so you go back and you can double check it. But we're working off of the main text right here, and then bringing in the sources. So I'm not giving you anything out of my own personal opinion. I may agree, I may disagree with the matter, but I'm trying to give you the most general sense. And then if I have an explanation and or a rebuttal for it, then I'll give you that. But I'll make it clear, or I'll try to make it clear that it's coming from me. It's my perspective, my opinion, my input into this, versus telling you that it's a fact. That's it. That's how it is. Um, when it's actually coming from me, and that's not what we want to do. So, you know, like I said, what parable? Because we didn't get the parable. It's not in the text, and so if we keep going, it says, and he said to them, Are you also lacking understanding? Don't you grasp that whatever goes into man cannot make him unholy? For it does not enter into the heart, but into the stomach, and then goes out into the sewers, cleansing all food. So here's the other part. Um, and you have to really analyze. Okay, so one, the issue here was not the bread. Okay, first of all, because it was kosher bread, and and the issue was tradition and wash the it began with the washing or the not washing of the hands, but it goes into this tradition that was developed that um, became uh, something that almost superseded the um, actual command, right? The commandments and what God, you know, wants from you. And so that's what Jesus is talking about. And that's what he's, you know, going after basically. And says, so we keep going, and then it says, and he continued, it is what comes out of man that makes the man unholy. For from within, out of the heart of men come evil intentions, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustfulness, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. So he gives a list of 13 things. And most of these are tied into one of the commandments, or some of these are even, tied to each other and then tied to the commandment. But he's basically giving you a Torah lesson 101, mitzvot all the way, and and kind of sticking to his main point. So now that we know that the question is not about kashrut or keeping kosher, the dietary laws, it's about being clean, unclean, pure, or impure. Then we can look at the wrong interpretations, um, because if you analyze what he responded, uh, most of the people, like I said, most of the Christian interpretation turned this part where it says cleansing all foods as him saying that it's okay to eat whatever you want, which is not the case. That's not what he's saying. He's actually saying, and it's kind of, if you analyze it, it's kind of disgusting, because he's saying it goes into the stomach, then goes out to the sewer, right? So it went through you. It didn't. It didn't make you unclean or unholy, uh, because it left you, right? And so, unless you want to go back and you know um, do what some of the animals do, which kind of basically chew on stuff and then regurgitate it, and that's what the one of the commands is, like what animals are clean or unclean is the ones that chew the cud and have split hooves that are considered kosher. And so with basically what it is that they chew the stuff, they regurgitate it, then they bring it back in and do it a couple of times in some cases, so that they can digest it. Um, I'm not thinking you want to actually do you know what he's not telling you to do it, but what he's actually answering. So I mean, let's read the text. Let's read it making common sense. And like I said, the other thing would be if Jesus does not keep the kosher um, dietary laws, then he is disqualified from being the Messiah, because the Messiah has to be the guy that you level it up to. And he says that that he comes to fulfill the Torah and the Nevi'im, or the prophets. So, and fulfill in the sense of making it complete, making it whole, making it being the right example for it, not the Christian interpretation in most cases that says that he's basically done away with that part. That's a wrong interpretation, because then once again you have to disqualify him from being who he says he was and who the apostles believed he was. And that's who I'm saying he was. I'm not trying to give you my personal um, belief system here, but that's just the way it is. Just understanding the culture and understanding the context of it, it you know it makes sense. uh, so um, like I said, Yeshua, Jesus, he kept kosher. He kept the kashrut dietary laws. And you know we when you talk about the messianic um, ideology and or prophecies, um, where they started to develop this concept of Mashiach, in particular a Mashiach that would come out of the house of David in a future time, and restore the kingdom, and all these things that are being talked about in the Gospels. And it's not a foreign subject to the Gospels. You can see where they're coming from, and you can see that there's um, intermingling of some of these concepts that are there. In some cases they're individual concepts. There was no and even in rabbinical Judaism today, there is no one uniform uh, uh, way of seeing Mashiach, and you'll see it all throughout the history and the literature that there's variations, and especially with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi scrolls and some of the other stuff that's being been found and studied. Um, you see that there's different viewpoints. Um, but a good example would be somebody who came after Jesus that that was a teacher, um, probably one of the most famous rabbis. First, we're talking about Rabbi Akiva. First, he was a convert to Judaism, so he was not originally or of Jewish descent. He converted to Judaism, and then he became a teacher, and he's the actually the one that basically um, calls Bar Kokhba, uh, you know, the Messiah. And so, nobody ever called him a heretic. Nobody ever, took him out of Judaism. Um, and even though he was clearly wrong, and even in his time, there was people that disagreed, and you'll see that some of the references towards Bar Kokhba himself are kind of derogatory. Um, but nobody's necessarily talking bad about Rabbi Akiva for saying that he was the Messiah. He made a mistake, and all right, let's do it. Or in today's terms, with Chabad, right, and thinking that the Rebbe is Mashiach, and some of the stuff that they do. If you parallel it, I mean, in today's viewpoint, it would seem somewhat familiar to Christians what they're doing. It really is in reverse. It's actually a Jewish thing that you know was embraced, and the issue here is who they view as Mashiach, right? And not all of Judaism. Actually, it's a small subset of Judaism that follows this. Um, for the most part, traditional rabbinical Judaism uh, is under the expectation of Mashiach coming, right? Um, but you also have the teachings of Mashiach ben David and Mashiach ben Yosef, but there's also Mashiach ben Aaron, and so there's all kinds of different variants. So the messianic uh, teaching is something that you're not going to find it in Torah explicitly. You have to understand and uh, read into it. Like I said, so Deuteronomy is one of those um, that was applied to the messianic uh, interpretation and teaching um, of the coming Messiah, right? But you know, there's other things that could be discussed. Jesus is also Ben Abraham, the son of Abraham. Um, he's, like I said, we already said son of David. Uh, he's also the Bar Adam, or the the Ben Adam or Bar Enosh, son of man, a reference that he makes constantly about himself. But it's also throughout a lot of the prophets, in particular. I want to say Ezekiel is one of them. Um, and so we just see that there's no one actual thing that unifies these things. It was a developing concept at the time, and even to an extent as of today. Uh, you know, it's just that the followers of Jesus took some of these concepts and with their understanding of what Jesus taught, they applied it to him, and or it was something that was, taught to his direct disciples, and then they passed it on to their disciples, and went forth. Um, Eventually, there is some distortion, and that's where you get Christianity and all that stuff. But that's years down the line. It's not anything that uh, Jesus himself did, and or his direct disciples, and or Paul, and even some of his direct uh, disciples. So, we can go into the Sheva Mitzvot, the seven no-hide laws. Okay, so we lost the video, but we'll continue here. We're almost closing, so um, like I was saying, that we could go into the Sheva Mitzvot, the what is known as the Noahide laws, um, which are pretty much addressed in Acts 15, and all you have to do is understand the conversion process in Judaism, um, from a uh, Talmudic and or Mishnaic perspective. Uh, Obviously, nowadays they make it much more complicated than it needs to be, but the actual conversion is fairly simple. It is to, if you're circumcised, uh, then you do what they call a toughest stone brick, um, which is basically uh, just the uh, getting a droplet of blood, um, because remember it is a blood covenant, and there's symbolism behind it. Um, but the second step would be to go into the mikveh, uh, in other words, uh, baptism. Okay, an immersion, a ritual immersion, um, and then it says you teach him some of the ways, you know, as they're dipping in, and then you teach them the rest of it, um, once they're out of the mikvah, and throughout their life. So they're basically Torah students at that point. Um, so uh, you know, to answer the question, did Jesus keep kosher? Yes, he did. I mean, this is just one example, but did Jesus tell anybody or his direct followers not to keep kosher? No, because then he would have led them astray, and you know that disqualifies him from being who he's claiming to be. And then um, just understanding where he's going with the teachings. So he made references to, the dietary laws, which are in Leviticus 11, uh, Leviticus 15, and even indirectly like Leviticus 23. And in Acts 15, we remember the discussion that was held was, well, how do we convert? What do we do with the Gentile? Um, we got a bunch of Gentiles coming in. What do we do with them? How do we convert them? And the method is pretty much same, with the exception of the circumcision, because the circumcision is not for salvation. And if you notice that there was Pharisees and Judaizers, that's the term that's used, um, that went to Antioch and started basically confusing some of the people there. And so that's when, and starting trouble and riling up. So that's when Paul gets called down. Paul and Barnabas get called down to Jerusalem to explain. And you know, Peter himself, goes in there and says, "Hey, you know what? It's like, uh, you know, you guys know what happened to me with Cornelius. You know, I got a vision, uh, and you know, if the Lord feels that that's the way he wants to bring them in, then so be it. Who are we to put in, burden them with anything that we can't even do?" And so it was decided, by James. So that's basically the the rebuttal. So just understanding, Gentiles were never obligated. They're still not obligated to keep those dietary laws. It doesn't have to do with them. It has to do something with Israel. Now, if you want to become part of Israel, then you have to take up those things, but you're not required to do so. Okay. Um, and just the major issue here is that um, it was a matter of being holy and or unholy, and um, the way that these people went and tried to uh, or the way they approached Jesus and his disciples was what triggered the whole situation. So um, I mean, we'll expand probably a little bit more on this. I think I covered everything for the most part. And like I said, it was triggered by a lesson that I was listening to, and you know, it just kind of like went from there. So just try to follow, what uh, the Spirit says, and just get it done. So it was just something I put together uh, today, and for the most part, I'm satisfied with how it came out. Um, but we're always learning. There's always more we can add to it. Maybe I get more insight the more research I do into it, so we can add this to a later discussion or lesson, and just understand that we are following Jesus. We're not following Jaime. We're not following the Pope. We're not following any particular rabbi. Although I have a lot of respect for a lot of these rabbis, whether traditional and or messianic. There's a lot of brilliant people. There's some brilliant secular scholars out there that are doing good work. Um, I mean, sad to say that they don't believe it, but there's enough interest there to where their work is fairly uh, accurate, and or doesn't have a lot of their personal influence or perspective. And um, as far as this goes, I think that's pretty much it. Like I said, well, if I find anything more additional stuff, we'll just expand on it. Add the the listen to the channel. But if you like what we're doing, once again, subscribe to the channel. Jaime Vision, Who's Your Rabbi is the main teaching uh, tool there, and you know, let's just try to be good followers of Jesus, good disciples. Um, and it's okay to have questions. Actually, we're pretty much required to have questions so that we can, come to the conclusion and come to an answer, um, but under the right uh, uh, guidance and the right teaching, and not coming up with a bunch of uh, stuff that would be foreign to the people that gave us the scriptures and the teachings that they passed down. um, and so we're we're always trying to learn something new. We're always in constant work. um, so with that being said, I want to say shalom and haba. And Psalm 122 says, Shalom, Shalom, Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Until next time, thank you.